Hello. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kathy Cullen, and on behalf of the Pennsylvania chapters of Citizens Climate Lobby, we welcome you to today's webinar, Exploring Forest Carbon. We created this event because we were curious about the intersection between carbon storage and forest policy, markets, and individual landowner priorities. We are very pleased to have with us three experts to help us understand these issues. Those experts are Kevin Yoder, Conservation Forester with the Nature Conservancy, Matt Gabler, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association, and Ellen Shultzabarger, Pennsylvania State Forester and Director of the Bureau of Forestry. We will begin with a short presentation from each of our panelists, followed by your questions and discussion. Our discussion today will be moderated by Calvin Norman, a forestry and wildlife educator with Penn State Extension. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. There are a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, this is a webinar, which means that while you can see us, we can't see you. This is a live event and it's being recorded. A copy of the recording will be made available to you. Our panelists will be using slides. If you would like to change the size of the slide, please click on the gray dividing line between slide and video and move it left or right. Also, you can access subtitles or a transcript by pressing on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the Citizens Climate Lobby of Pennsylvania chapters for hosting this event. With over 400 chapters in the United States, Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers work together to influence climate policy at the local, state, and national level. We are a nonpartisan organization focused on building relationships with our elected representatives in order to enact effective climate legislation. We know that any climate solution will need to use all the tools at our disposal. That includes the extraordinary power of healthy forests to draw down and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Kevin Yoder from the Nature Conservancy.
Thank you very much, Kathy. As Kathy mentioned, my name is Kevin Yoder. I'm a forester with the Nature Conservancy. And throughout my career, I have worked with private landowners to help them manage their forests in a way that meets multiple objectives. Traditionally, that has been the production of forest products, creating and enhancing wildlife habitat, and providing recreational opportunities, or maintaining water quality. And forest carbon is becoming an increasing part of that conversation that the landowner wants to manage for and that land managers need to consider. And so a theme that I want to really focus on today through my slides is how do we integrate forest carbon into our management decisions? And then how do we balance that out with some of our other objectives? So to begin with just some carbon science 101 and how forests play a role. So forests are one of several natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions where we actually harness the power of nature to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and to mitigate global warming that way. And there's two ways that trees contribute to that. And they're kind of different. So I think it's important to really understand these dual roles. One is carbon sequestration. Through photosynthesis, the trees are actively taking carbon dioxide out of the air, actively growing and storing a portion of that carbon within the tree itself. And then so that's the sequestration, and then storage is how much carbon is actually being locked up in the forest, whether that's in the tree or in the soils, and preventing that locked in carbon from being emitted back into the atmosphere. And we think about how much storage there is. Approximately 1/2 of the dry weight of a tree or of wood consists of stored carbon. So if we think of the weight of a tree or the weight of the desk that I'm sitting at right now, half of that weight is carbon. And both sequestration and storage are very important when we are talking about using forests for climate mitigation. And we think about where is the carbon stored in the forest. This diagram here shows what's known as different carbon pools, or different parts of the forest and where the carbon is stored. And we can see that most of the carbon is stored there in the trunks and branches. And that, as forest managers, that's something that we really focus on. Basically, how much wood is there in the forest, and how can we maximize the amount of wood and therefore the amount of carbon stored within that wood. You also see on here that soil carbon is a very important pool. Right now, forest managers are really trying to figure out how do our management decisions and our activities influence the soil carbon. We know we want to keep the soil healthy. We want to make sure that carbon stays locked into that soil. But we're still working at, how does our management decisions influence that soil? So a lot of what I will be talking about today and some of my recommendations really focus on what would be called the above ground carbon, specifically trunks and branches. If we think about using forests, there's 3 general strategies that we want to consider when we're thinking about using forests for climate mitigation. Number 1 is just increasing and maintaining forest land. We want forest on the landscape. That means avoiding development and deforestation. But then within those forests, how can we make that forest healthy and productive so that we're increasing the carbon sequestration, we're maximizing the amount of carbon that forest is taking out of the atmosphere? There are healthy forests and there are unhealthy forests. And as forest managers, it's our job to make sure that those forests are healthy and resilient and actively growing and sequestering carbon. And then a third component that's very important is how do we use wood products to keep that carbon locked up in a forest product? Again, the desk that I'm sitting at, it's wood. Half of that weight is carbon. And when we take a tree and we turn it into a long-lived forest product, we keep that carbon locked in there. And we see the greatest benefit of wood products when we use those in substitution of a more energy intensive product, such as plastic or steel or concrete. One such example would be using wood in taller buildings. In certain states, they are creating multi-story buildings out of engineered wood, and instead we are now using less steel and concrete. So we're not having a big carbon emission associated with the production of that steel and concrete, and we are keeping carbon locked up in the wood. If we talk about that second strategy, how do we manage our forests? We want to keep our forests healthy. We want them actively growing, sequestering carbon. And if a forest is degraded and is unproductive, what do we do to restore that condition and make it healthier? Fortunately, forest managers have the science and the expertise to know how to manage forests. Again, carbon sequestration, maximum carbon, is very equal to maximizing the amount of wood in the forest, which is what foresters do. So we use our forestry treatments to increase growth. In Pennsylvania, if we're talking about a young forest or a regenerating forest, we're really focusing on controlling invasive plants and competing vegetation, or protecting those young seedlings from deer browsing. In both those scenarios, that factor is inhibiting seedling growth and is reducing the amount of sequestration. Or if it's time to do a timber harvest, we want to make sure that harvest is sustainable, that we are leaving behind the trees that are going to be very vigorous and continue to grow and continue to be resilient. And we also want to make sure that our timber harvests are done in a way that minimizes damage to our residual trees so that they can stay healthy and they can continue to sequester carbon. And when we also think about forests, it's important to balance age classes. Old forests, specifically forests over 100 years old, are really important for carbon storage. If we think about an old forest, the trees are big, there's lots of them. Some trees have died, but they still have carbon held within that dead tree. Very good for carbon, but as you'll see later today, not as high sequestration rates. On the other hand, young forests, especially forests 30 to 70 years old, that's when we're seeing our maximized carbon sequestration. That's when our photosynthesis is the highest. And we have our active our sequestration, but there's not as much carbon stored within that young forest. So we need to have a balance of those, not just for a carbon perspective, but also for wildlife and biodiversity. There's certain wildlife species that only use young forests and only use old. So if I had to really summarize my recommendations down to one sentence, is we need to manage our forest thinking about both sequestration and storage. And when we think about how we are going to manage those, what our treatments are going to be, we need to make sure that those are going to be compatible with our landowner management goals and priorities, and always consider what's our diversity, our forest productivity, and our forest health. So I want to just go through a quick example of how do we take those goals and kind of implement that into a program or on the ground. And I'm going to point to the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is a program that's now available for Pennsylvania residents, and it's being launched through American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. And we have two practices that landowners can sign up and implement, and each has a little bit different goal based on storage or sequestration. Our one practice is called growing mature forests. And in this one, we really are focused on carbon storage. We want to keep carbon stored within those trees and maximize those carbon stocks. We allow landowners to do some thinning through here and do a little bit of improvement cutting. But for the most part, we're going to take a forest that's semi-mature and really let that continue to grow for another couple decades. On the other hand, if the landowner's objective is to create young forests, do a timber harvest, whether to create income or create wildlife habitat, but we see that there's competing vegetation or invasive plants. We know that that is going to inhibit new growth and minimize and reduce sequestration. Landowners can sign up for that practice to control those competing competing vegetation, release those seedlings. So now we have faster growth, better sequestration. We also have better wildlife habitat and better biodiversity as a result. And we think too about just how, this forest management and this idea of balancing our different goals. It's much more than just carbon. As I mentioned, we're integrating this into our other goals. And a lot of landowners focus on wildlife. And one of the neat things about forest management and natural climate solutions in general is it's not just about the climate. It benefits wildlife, water quality, recreation. And for example, with the Family Forest Carbon Program, those two practices benefit a wide range of wildlife species. If we talk about growing mature forests, where we're maximizing those carbon stocks, that's going to benefit wildlife like scarlet tanager, wood thrush, and black-throated blue warbler. Whereas with the enhancing the future forest, that's creating young forest habitat or early successional habitat. And there's a whole suite of wildlife species that utilize that habitat. And those populations are declining, such as golden winged warbler or American woodcock. And so there again, we're trying to find the balance between young forests and old forests and carbon storage and sequestration and those other multiple benefits that forests provide as well. So that provides a quick overview as far as how we integrate forest carbon into our management decisions. If you're interested in reaching out to me with any questions, there's my email. If you're interested in the Family Forest Carbon Program, that website at the bottom, familyforestcarbon.org is a great resource. And I look forward to our Q&A session later in this webinar.
Thank you, Kevin, for that excellent overview of forest carbon management. Our next speaker is Matt Gabler from the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to present here today. Let me get my slides pulled up. There we go. Well, as Kathy mentioned, my name is Matt Gabler, and I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association. And I am very honored that the organizers of this webinar have invited me to share a little bit of information with you today regarding forest carbon forest products, and the decisions that you can make to improve our forest health and the impact that our forests have on the composition of our atmosphere. First, a little bit about myself and the PFPA. I've been in this role for almost a year, and I'm proud to represent over 260 member companies that make up the entire forest product supply chain, from landowners and foresters to loggers and sawmills, manufacturers, and the suppliers who support the process. And of course, our industry is made up of the people who work in the industry, which amounts to about 64,000 jobs across the Commonwealth in each of Pennsylvania's 67 counties. While the economy of many small communities across the state depends upon the economic activity provided by our industry, it's a little known fact that the bulk of the jobs that our industry supports is actually in the manufacturing sector in the southeastern portion of the state, an area of the state that may not be as closely associated in people's minds with forests, but certainly we have a supply chain that crosses the state and really touches every sector and every geographic reach within the Commonwealth. When looking at Pennsylvania's forest resource, many people don't realize that we have much more forest today than we did 75 years ago. On average, each year our forests grow between 3 and 4 billion board feet, and we lose about 1 billion board feet to natural mortality. And the industry harvests about 1 billion board feet. So that means that our forest volume is increasing by roughly 2 billion board feet every year. So even though we are harvesting all throughout the state, double of what we cut is growing back. This helps to illustrate how renewable our forest resource really is. Now, I'm sure that all of us have heard about the threat of deforestation as it relates to tropical rainforests. It is important to remember that different forest types have different needs and face different pressures. Thankfully, deforestation is not the sort of threat in Pennsylvania's hardwood forest as we see elsewhere, and the sustainable forestry that's practiced here allows for abundant beneficial regrowth. A few concepts that I was hoping to share with you before we get started to kind of set the table. Pennsylvania is the nation's #1 hardwood producing state. Hardwood comes from deciduous or leafy trees. It is a higher quality wood, ideal for furniture and finishings, such as flooring and cabinets. Softwood, on the other hand, comes from coniferous trees or trees with needles. And that's what's mainly used in the framing and construction as dimensional lumber. Softwood forests are more prominent across the US South and across Canada, whereas Pennsylvania's climate with 4 distinct seasons provides the ideal setting for hardwood forests. There is a right and a wrong way to harvest a forest. Sustainable forestry is essential not only to the health of our forest and our environment, but also to the survival of our industry. As has been, as you may hear or mentioned by some foresters, high grading is one example of what not to do. And high grading is this: it's when you harvest all of the so-called good trees in a forest, and then you leave behind all the undesirable ones. You will have ruined that forest because there will be no trees left to provide the seeds for the beneficial regrowth. A proper harvest, which can be adapted to prioritize wildlife habitat, saw timber, or other management priorities, will typically require the removal of low-grade trees, which can be beneficially reused to make paper or biomass. You'll also harvest certain saw logs, the good stuff, and then you'll also need to have the discipline to leave good specimens from desirable species behind after growing, leave them growing after a harvest. These trees will then be the stock that will reseed the forest and generate new forest growth. The practice of managing all this is known as silviculture. Now, you may be wondering, who can I talk to if I want to make sure that my forest is properly managed? In that case, you're going to want to talk to a professional forester, someone who understands forest management strategies. They can talk to you about your priorities, how you want to manage your land, and what methods will enable you to achieve your goals. When it comes time to harvest, the forester will help you work with the logger to determine which trees to cut and which ones to keep. And if you're wondering how you might be able to find a forester, I would encourage you, a good place to start would be on the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association webpage. We have a list of our members. You can look up a directory and find out, look for a forester in a county near you, and that would be a good place to start. Now, we all know that trees won't live forever, so it is worth noting some prominent factors that can lead to tree mortality. A goal of sustainable forestry is to beneficially use the forest resource before it dies or degrades. If we are too late, trees will decay and emit their carbon back into the atmosphere. Thankfully, forest fires are not a prominent issue in Pennsylvania like they are in places like the Western United States, but they can happen as well. In Pennsylvania, we've seen recently a tragedy of a different sort, invasive species which can cause mass mortality. The emerald ash borer came to the US from Asia and has had a devastating effect on North American species of ash trees. A healthy ash tree is a very desirable sawlog, useful for flooring or furniture. But a dead tree like the one pictured is pretty much good for only firewood. Most remaining ash trees in our region are unfortunately being harvested for firewood in order to eliminate the danger of collapse. But the opportunity to turn them into good, valuable lumber in many cases has passed. So now let's start putting it all together. As we think about the growth of our forests, it's helpful to look at how a forest captures and stores carbon over time. As we all know, through the process of photosynthesis, trees take in carbon dioxide from the air and release oxygen. The carbon from the CO2 becomes stored in the wood, and the chart on this slide shows two pieces of information related to this, charted over a common timeline. The green curve is pretty straightforward. It shows how the quantity of carbon stored in a forest builds up over time. As the wood grows, the quantity of stored carbon increases. But you will also notice that as the forest reaches maturity, the amount of carbon stored flattens out. This is because old trees slow down and eventually stop growing. The brown curve shows the rate of carbon capture and shows us that younger forests capture more carbon per year than older ones. This illustrates how we can manage our forests for optimal carbon capture and storage. Harvesting mature forests enables us to convert those trees into products like lumber, furniture, flooring, and cabinets. These products all keep the carbon locked up instead of releasing it into our atmosphere, much as Kevin had mentioned. The harvest then makes room for the regrowth of new trees. Therefore, a sustainable timber harvest converts stored carbon from slow-growing trees into products while making room in the forest for fast-growing trees that will capture carbon much more effectively than the trees that were removed. Public policymakers look at various categories of behaviors that can impact the carbon equation. From vehicles to power plants, from farming to building standards, there are discussions ongoing regarding how to put less carbon into the atmosphere. In our category, we are discussing how we can take more carbon out of the atmosphere. This category is frequently referred to as land use change, and forestry, or LULUCF as an acronym. It refers to the reforestation and afforestation strategies that my fellow panelists will discuss, as well as the sustainable forestry practices utilized in a proper harvest. In the carbon equation, the most attention goes to changed behaviors which impact carbon sequestration and storage. By changing our behaviors, the intent is to enable our forests to do an even better job absorbing carbon than they otherwise would. Secondly, we can reduce emissions by looking at the carbon footprint of other materials versus the carbon footprint of a wood product. By choosing to use wood instead of steel, concrete, vinyl, and plastic when possible, you are making decisions that point the carbon equation in the right direction. These changed behaviors factor prominently in the design of carbon credit programs, which enable carbon-producing entities to purchase offsets, which are intended to incentivize landowners to take carbon-negative actions to offset the purchaser's carbon emissions. The focus is on the marginal change. How did someone manage their land differently, and what were the carbon impacts of those management decisions? Our input to this process is that we understand that many of these programs are still evolving. We encourage the designers of these programs to prominently factor in the value of stored carbon in products in the incentive structure of any carbon offset program. If a purchaser of a carbon offset causes marketable saw logs not to be cut, have they made a positive impact on the carbon equation? In Pennsylvania, considering the rate of growth of our forests and the rate that we are currently harvesting, carbon offset buyers should be empowered to look to timber harvesters as partners, not as competitors bidding over the same commodity. And so I'll conclude with a few summarizing thoughts. Our forests are a wonderful resource whose health and environmental benefits can be optimized through sustainable forestry and management. The management of our forests can optimize carbon capture and storage while providing other environmental benefits, such as superior wildlife habitat and better air and water quality. Our forests also provide us with a building material that has a smaller carbon footprint than the alternatives. Beware of the myths. While a vinyl flooring manufacturer would like to convince you that their product is more environmentally friendly because they didn't cut down a tree, we all know that the sustainably harvested tree will store its carbon in your floor and does so without the need for all of the other chemicals and energy-intensive processes that were used to make that vinyl. Finally, consider the opportunity cost of doing nothing. We clearly see the opportunity cost of every ash tree that went unharvested until it was too late and now can only be used for firewood. While a successful harvest keeps carbon locked up, the failure to harvest at the right time will lead to death and decay, forest fire, or some other means of emitting carbon back into the atmosphere. It is our hope that we can continue to partner with landowners and policymakers to maximize the beneficial impact we can have on the carbon equation and our environment. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make this presentation today, and I'll look forward to the question and answer at the end of this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for that extensive overview of the forest products industry. I'd like to remind you, attendees, if you have a question, be sure to put it in the Q&A feature. And now I'm happy to welcome Ellen Shultzabarger from the Pennsylvania Forestry Bureau.
All right. Am I sharing my screen here? Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for having us, or having me and us today, and I appreciate the invitation and the time. I'm Ellen Shultzabarger, and I'm the director of the Bureau of Forestry, and I serve as a state forester working with other state agencies and the U.S. Forest Service. I've been in this position for about 3 years now. We are the lead forestry agency here in Pennsylvania, working on both Pennsylvania's public and private lands. And I wanted to say thanks to Matt and Kevin for your presentations. They were really great in setting up some of the things that I have in here, and I'll breeze through some of those where we have some shared messages here. So forests and trees are the source of so much that society needs, and we've talked about that already: clean water, clean air, wood products, wildlife habitat, opportunities for solitude and recreation, and of course that critical role in absorbing carbon emissions. And over the last decade, forests in the United States have continued to sequester more carbon than they are emitting. I think it was Matt that talked about that, and really play a critical role in what we're talking about today. And I'd like to touch on some general forest topics that will maintain and improve and promote PA's forest ability to sequester and store carbon. And some of these I'll breeze through because Matt and Kevin touched on them pretty well. But when I talk about Pennsylvania forests, I want to make sure that you understand that I'm talking about all of them. So from the big woods in the North Central to the Ridge and Valley to our neighborhood or suburban forests, and then our urban forests and trees. So we'll talk about all forests. And I wanted to at least show this graphic from the Forest Service, and it was already touched on, but one of the critical pieces to all of this is really keeping forests as forests. First, as you know, Pennsylvania was once, well, right now we're about 60% forested. It was once about 95% forested. And at one point when it was over harvested, it went down to about 30%. It's key to continue to maintain or improve that percentage of forest cover. And this graphic really shows the importance of that on the carbon roll side, right? Wood products from well-managed forests store forest carbon and offer those carbon benefits. And that was already discussed. And you see that difference in that carbon loop cycle on the left versus that open system on the right. So one of the major goals for us and, you know, basically state forestry agencies and then the U.S. Forest Service is making sure that we're keeping forests and keeping forest products. So promoting that no net loss of forest land, keeping them forests, and then protecting forests, offering ways to continue to have these forests on the landscape, be it working forests or not, including tools like acquisitions, conservation easements, or other incentives to not convert to some other form other than a forest. So as you can see in this graphic, forests play a critical role. And it was mentioned earlier, the diversity, and that is certainly one of those key pieces in having good forests that are sequestering carbon well. First is managing that diversity of forest age classes. And so if you think about when all of Pennsylvania's forests were mostly cut at about the same time, about 100 years ago. So when you look at of that chart and you see that basically, if they're cut all at the same time, they're also going to grow all at the same time and be older at the same time. And then our carbon sequestration and storage rates go down all at the same time. But if we're balancing those age classes across the state, we'll have that balance of young to old forests, and then we won't have an impact all at once. It's not only good just on the carbon side, but it's very good for wildlife as well. And here's another graphic that really points to the importance of diversity. And it's not just the age, but it's the tree species and forest community diversity is important as well. So tree species absorb and store carbon at different rates, which is showed here on two graphics, community type and then some tree species. So it's important to manage for diversity of the forest communities, not just for those carbon storage rates, but, and I think Kevin talked about it earlier, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and it really leads to those healthy, resilient forests. So we want to keep trees, we want them to be diverse, we want them to be healthy. The diversity really helps in maintaining healthy and resilient forests. Healthy and diverse forests typically are able to accommodate some of those minor or sometimes severe disturbances and be able to adapt, and that's called resilience. But you know, there are times where it all happens at once and it's frequent, and maybe if you didn't have a diverse forest, it is really impacted. So Matt talked about emerald ash borer and ash. Some areas we've had a significant disturbance, especially with ash in some of the community or urban areas. So there's a variety of forest management practices, and Matt and Kevin touched on those that really can help manage for that diversity and promoting that overall health. And it's different depending on where you are. You know, it was mentioned the fire-prone systems, which is really what you hear a lot about the West, where they're applying prescribed fire to reduce that fuel load. Here, we're really focusing on that forest health, reducing invasive plants and invasive pests. So in many cases, the forest practices that enhance sequestration are also those practices that increase forest resilience. So good forest management is equaling good carbon management. And I'm not going to go too far into timber harvesting here. You know, Matt and Kevin really handled and covered that well, but I do want to at least touch on this. Harvesting is considered sustainable when decisions are based on silvicultural knowledge and follow a long-term management plan. Matt had suggested, you know, hopping on their website to look for some forestry professionals, and I would say the same thing. There's very many variables and values to understand and balance when you're looking at managing a forest. Historic practices, forest age, forest type, biodiversity, and really it's a lot to take in and understand. And I didn't touch on this earlier, but most of Pennsylvania's forests are privately owned. It's about 70% of them. So it's mostly families and individuals with small tracts versus, say, like companies, timber companies that actually have professionals on site and understand those silviculture practices. So those professional foresters are really important in helping managers or owners understand and meet those management objectives. So the Bureau of Forestry has service foresters in every county. Same thing, head to our website, find someone who can help guide you on forests and trees. They can connect you with some of those local folks that Matt also mentioned. But it's important to remember that when forests maintain their value as forests, either by providing wood products, carbon storage, wildlife habitat, they're more likely to remain as forests in the future when ownership changes. Forest management plans can help identify and work landowners through that and understanding how best to manage it, and then in the long term, be maintained as forests moving forward. And so I wanted to touch on tree planting because as many have become aware, and I think it's part of, at least it's part of my everyday almost, either we're talking about carbon forest management or we're talking about planting trees. Adding trees and forests provide a great benefit in sequestering and storing carbon, as you know. So these tree plantings can be in areas that they haven't existed for decades, like cities, farmlands, or mine lands, called afforestation, or reforesting in areas that have been degraded or impacted, like after a disease, emerald ash borer, drought, or maybe in areas that weren't sustainably managed. There's many tree planting efforts going on right now. And if you think of a lot of those companies that are looking to reduce their carbon footprint, a lot of that effort is going towards tree planting. But it's important to remember there should be careful planning when planting a tree. Too often they're planted and they die because there's no planning or care. So please consider the tree species that you're planting at the site, the care and maintenance that's needed after you plant them, just like you would with your garden or your tree plantings in your backyard. Availability of tree seedlings, I will say nurseries are working overtime, trying to keep up with that demand, and being able to have funding available to get into communities to restore with trees. And I will mention some of our programs that we do have here in Pennsylvania. We have been working hard on getting programs set up and funding set to get trees on the ground. We have an urban and community tree planting program called Tree Vitalize, where we're planting 4,000 to 8,000 trees a year. And then we also, so that's your kind of afforestation, getting them in new areas. And then we also have a restoration program where we're planting trees along streams to protect watersheds, either buffers or converting lawns to forests. So we're working to get that funding and programs out. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention that's on there is the Keystone Tree Fund, where we can actually receive donations in your vehicle registration or just get direct donations to put back into those urban and riparian planting programs. And so to think about that diversity that I talked about earlier and that we already talked about is also to think about those species that may be more suited for potential future climate conditions. We have a climate adaptation plan, and in there we have been working with NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, at the Forest Service to create some climate change projections for tree species, how they may fare under different conditions. Now, I put this up there to take a look, and it helps you kind of think through those things. They are models. Use it as a general guide. It's not the end all be all, but it does help folks kind of understand and think about before you do tree plantings, what is appropriate at my site. And finally, the U.S. forests have the potential to store hundreds of millions of tons of carbon per year over the next decade. And it's definitely possible for us to unlock this potential forest as a climate solution, but we need to make shifts in policies to make it happen. There are a flurry of net zero carbon commitments from large companies like Microsoft, IKEA, Pepsi, and I think the last thing I read was like maybe 1,500 companies, national, international, and Pennsylvania companies. So forestry agencies are working to be at the front line of these forest carbon issue, either with the state forest lands that they manage or in their work with private landowners. And us here in the Bureau of Forestry, we're working with our Pennsylvania partners, TNC and PFPA, to make sure that we are working on and understanding the unique barriers and opportunities these different landowners face, or companies, or state agencies for that matter, in order to undertake these forest carbon management actions. We want to maximize those existing authorities and create new policies and finance opportunities. It's complex, but it can create some great outcomes. So we're currently working with some other partners on, and I put up 3 examples that are being discussed right now, really just kind of bundling and understanding those other environmental services together. So, we talk about watershed protection or biodiversity or recreation. How can we bundle those opportunities for landowners? And then, of course, expanding those different cost share programs or being able to emphasize carbon within those programs. And then finally, the carbon tracking system is very complex and as often time consuming. So how do we make this doable? And how do we make it affordable and a little bit easier to navigate as a private landowner? Or even, for me, it is complex. And the program that Kevin mentioned is definitely been able to do that and make it easier to navigate. So I want to say thank you, and we definitely have a remarkable opportunity here in front of us in the forest and conservation community. Forest and trees are valued more than ever today. I think 1,500 folks are looking to really focus on and capitalize and basically capture this opportunity. And it's going to require that we identify appropriate forest management practices and policy solutions to encourage the adoption of of these practices by thousands of forest landowners, timber companies, and managers. And outreach and education is key in this effort. I don't know about you, but for me and many others, these forest carbon markets isn't always easy to absorb and kind of understand and wrap your head around. So it's our job to translate and engage on this. The forest community and conservation field has always been about managing the many forest values over the long haul under all these changing circumstances. And today our work really is no different than 100 years ago. We just have some different circumstances. So I'm looking forward to these conversations and working through our opportunities here. So thank you, and appreciate your time and listening, and looking forward to the conversation here later. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ellen, for that excellent policy overview. Calvin Norman from Penn State Extension has joined us to lead the discussion. So take it away, Calvin.
All right, thank you. So we have a number of excellent questions in here about forest carbon, climate change, and there's a lot of questions about invasive species. So let's talk about invasive species first. Kevin, would you mind taking a crack at how invasive species impact forest carbon, and why it's important that we manage them and prevent invasion?
Sure thing, Calvin. So invasive species or non-native invasive species would be plants that come from usually across the ocean and really disrupt our ecosystem. Our forests are not adapted to these species. Examples would be Ailanthus, tree of heaven, Japanese stiltgrass, multiflora, rose, and they really just thrive because we notice they tend to have a little bit of a longer growing seasons that they're adapted to. Deer often don't browse them. They're prolific seeders. That's why we call them invasive. And so they will either displace species. If we think tree of heaven, they usually grow instead of poplar that we would see in typical areas. Japanese stiltgrass, if you've ever walked along a trail in the woods, it probably has Japanese stiltgrass along that, and that can spread and suppress other growth. And especially in the instance of Japanese stiltgrass, that's a herbaceous plant. That's not really sequestering and storing a lot of carbon, and suppressing those trees that would. So it's that growth suppression, and then also we don't see the diversity. Again, I keep harping on diversity because that is something that we really need to consider. And when you have just one species that's invasive compared to multiple native species, you're going to have less sequestration. You're also going to have less adequate wildlife habitat. We're never going, I'm going to say, we're never going to eradicate non-native species. They are here. They are something we have to deal with, but we need to manage those populations so that the forest can still regenerate and grow whenever there's a disturbance.
Awesome, thanks. Ellen, do you want to talk about how the DCNR is, or you want to talk about how the DCNR is responding to invasive species, and how you guys are working to maintain a healthy forest and one that responds well to disturbance?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, invasive species, be it plants or pests or diseases, are really on the forefront of how we are thinking about and managing forests. So we actually have protocols set in place to monitor for the introduction of these species, and we try to take care of them when we find new populations to make sure that they aren't taking over, and we have an opportunity to kind of eradicate them in their area instead of having them basically just spread across. So we are doing rapid response and getting rid of them as soon as possible. And really at this point, we are identifying some of those priority species, and Kevin kind of mentioned some of those. We could, and I joke, we could be the Bureau of Invasive Stuff if we really wanted to just spend our time 100% dealing with some sort of non-native species that is impacting the forest. So we really have to prioritize our time and our funds and making sure that we're really being impactful in those communities, those forest communities. And education and outreach is huge for us. So we have a forest health program that is working statewide to provide information on those forest pests and invasive plants. So it is an important part of making sure that we are maintaining a resilient and healthy forest.
Awesome. So let's flip to a little different part. Let's talk about harvesting. So we have a couple of questions in here about forest certification and how we make sure we're buying sustainable wood products. Matt, you want to handle that?
I was hoping you would ask me that. When I read that question come across, I was looking around the office to see if I could find an example. So bear with me on this, but I found a box that was sitting. Of course, I haven't unpacked my entire office yet. And I want to see if I can show this to, but this is just actually somewhat of an old box. But if you look at the very bottom of the box, I'm going to point right here at my camera. That is the logo of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, SFI. If you start looking for this logo, you're going to start seeing it more places than you ever dreamed that it was. So the two main organizations, actually, I think there's three big ones. SFI, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. There's FSC, the Forest, I'm going to trip over this, Forest Sustainability Council, I believe is the acronym. And then there's also the Tree Farm System. Those are three certification programs that speak specifically to sustainable forestry practices. And in order to be SFI certified, there has to be certain criteria that are met, SFI, FSC, or Tree Farm certified. So that would be the best thing that I would encourage a consumer to do is look at the products that you buy and look for those certifications on there. And that would be a great way to be an informed consumer and look to make sure that you're choosing from good sources and sustainably harvested.
Wonderful. Ellen, is the DCNR certified at all?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I do really like the certification process, and we are SFI and FSC certified. So the whole 2.2 million acres, and it's a really great process in looking at all those practices that are part of timber harvesting, from ENS, erosion and sedimentation control, to biodiversity, to how you make harvesting decisions and those silvicultural practices. So yeah, it's a really important and helpful tool in us managing, and really allows you to share as a public agency, share with the public how we are managing the forest, those practices that we are being reviewed and audited, and those standards and protocols that we are meeting to ensure that there are sustainably harvest forests across, well, I guess across sorry, I'm getting tripped up, across Pennsylvania, and mostly on state forest lands here when I was talking about those 2.2 million acres.
All right. So let's keep in the harvesting vein here. Can we, how prevalent is high grading? How do we avoid it? And then also, can we clarify cutting versus harvesting? Kevin, I'm going to jump to you for cutting versus harvesting. Maybe we could talk about regeneration practices versus thinning.
Yeah, so whenever I oversee a timber harvest or work with the land manager that's overseeing a timber harvest, if we're going to do this sustainably, we are more concerned about what is going to be left behind in that forest, or how that forest is going to respond, than what's coming out. And I would say that's kind of, at surface level, that's the biggest difference. If we're thinking about maximizing revenue, we're looking at what are the most valuable trees out there. That's what I want. But if we're thinking about long-term sustainability, it is what trees can I take out to make this a commercial sale while making sure I'm leaving either a good seed source in a mature tree, or I have young trees on the ground ready to take the place of the mature trees that I'm going to cut. And so that's where it is. And there's a lot of science and a lot of research that goes into this. There's a whole field called silviculture, which is really the art and science of making sure that we are cutting these trees in a way that promotes long-term sustainable forestry. So that would be the difference. There's very great harvests that occur, and there's poor harvests that occur in the state. And there's a whole community of forest practitioners that are really working to integrate sustainability into our timber harvest as much as possible. And so my advice to any landowner out there is to work with a consulting forester that's reputable. There's landowner groups available that work with, that know some kind of best practices to make sure you get included in a timber harvest. Because again, as I've mentioned, balance and diversity is key. And that it does include sustainable timber harvest in the right scenario.
Matt, do you want to talk about harvesting a little bit more and the importance of good harvesting practices?
Absolutely. I think, I think Kevin did a great job talking about the difference between cutting versus harvesting. I think the one thing that's been very very pleasing to me to see how things are lining up is that, obviously we learn more as we go. And when you look at the practices that are ongoing today, some things based on consumer demand, such as the demand for certified products that have the logos like FSC and SFI, but then also to look at many of our companies or entities or our timber harvesters, our loggers, they're multi-generational family businesses, and so it is very, very heartening to see how the participants in the marketplace are seeing that not only does it make good environmental sense, but also their bottom line, their long-time sustainability depends on them being disciplined. So from a harvesting perspective, we're seeing that that the incentives are pointing in the right place, not only because consumers demand it, not only because environmental best practices demand it, but also because in order to have an industry that is going to be sustainable and continuing to provide jobs and continuing to provide good products into the future, the sustainable forestry practices need to be followed. So unfortunately, sometimes if somebody were to look at too short of a time frame, they might make a bad calculation. But if you look at the right calculation over a long period of time, you're going to come to the same conclusion, whether you're doing it for environmental reasons or for economic reasons. A good decision that is made is going to point that direction. And we're seeing that that is the state of the art in the industry today.
Ellen, could you, for folks who are interested in working with a forester, but don't really know how to get started, would you mind talking about the service forester positions a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, I wanted to add, or stress at least that importance of thinking about managing your forests in the long term. And both Kevin and Matt mentioned that is you're really thinking about what those conditions would be in the future, not what you want right this very second. And those are very different decisions. And when you're thinking about carbon management, you want to think long term. And so we have service foresters in each of the counties that can work with you and connect you with foresters. They can connect you with loggers and some of those folks that are on Matt's list at PFPA. And they can really help you think through what are some of those objectives for my forest? What are those opportunities or values? So do you have rare species? Do you have some watershed protection opportunities? What would your carbon benefit be here? And then connect you with groups like AFF and TNC for the family forest carbon, or be able to connect you with a consulting forester that can help you work through and talk about what those needs are in the forest to reduce or make it a more resilient forest moving forward. And what are those opportunities for wood products? And like I said earlier in my presentation was we want to make sure people understand those values and maintain those values in their forests, and that in the long term ensures that they maintain and keep being forests, which is really important in that broad carbon cycle that we talked about. And it's a really environmentally friendly carbon cycle. So anyway, the management plans and the consulting forester can help you, kind of get there at the long term. But for us, it's really important because it helps us value and keep forests as forests. So, and yeah, I think I have in the chat where we have information on where you can get information on your county service forester who can kind of help you through thinking through your forest.
Wonderful, thank you. And I work with a number of service forests. I just really recommend anyone who's thinking about, it's just starting with forest management, work with your local service forester. They're really going to help you out. They're a huge aid. And also feel free to call Penn State Extension if you have any questions, and we can be helpful too. I got to do a little self plug, a little self promotion. We are running close to time. What are folks' thoughts on continuing the discussion, or do we have a number of questions to get to still? Do we have time to keep going? Okay, we'll keep going for a little bit longer, but we'll make sure we're done to respect everyone else's time here. So Kevin, could you explain the Family Forest Carbon Program a little bit? What's the minimum size? How does it work? And also, where are you going to? We got folks from New York wondering if you're coming there. What's it look like?
Yeah, so the Family Forest Carbon Program is a rapidly growing project and program. And right now, we launched in central Pennsylvania, moved to north central, then moved to western Pennsylvania, and it's either statewide today or within a few days. We're very close to going statewide. Sorry, I don't know the exact date, but within a couple of weeks, all Pennsylvania residents that own at least 30 acres of forested land are eligible for that. So that is our minimum size. And if you're fortunate to have a lot of land, 2,400 acres is our maximum size. As I mentioned, we have two practices, growing mature forest and enhancing future forest available. The link, familyforestcarbon.org, rwoodscamp.com. I see that's in the chat. Both are great ways to initiate that sign up for that. The first step would be to talk over the program, and then a forester would come out to your property and see what would be the best fit based on your forest condition, and if that aligns with your goals and objectives. As far as expansion, we are looking at expanding into Western Maryland and West Virginia very soon. New York, I think, is a little bit further out, at least Southern New York. I know there's another pilot that we're launching in the New England area that I think does touch Northern New York some as well. So we are expanding, we are growing. I don't have an exact timeline on availability, but we do expect over the next few years for that program to be launched and available across the Appalachians.
So Kevin, how do folks get into a carbon program? You can be specific and talk about your program. I'll let you do a little self-promotion. How do folks get into it if they're looking for getting into the Family Forest Carbon Program?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, for the Family Forest Carbon Program, you start with those links. It is a very digital-based program, at least starting out and getting signed up. So again, familyforestcarbon.org, rwoodscamp.com, both those links are already in the chat. That will connect you with a specialist that works with the landowners that goes over talking about your property. Are you already working with a forester? What are some of your goals? And then they will schedule a site visit with the forester. That forester comes out, looks at the condition, does some forest inventory work to see what you would be available for. And then we would continue that conversation to see if it would be the right fit for you. There are other carbon projects available. My advice in general is really understand what the time commitment is for your carbon project. Carbon projects are long. For the growing mature forest practice with the Family Forest Carbon Program, that's 20 years. Other carbon projects go 40 or 100 years. And even if your contract says 1 year or 2 years or 5 years, check the fine print to see what the actual length of that contract is and how long you are locked into a certain type of management. So really do your research, really dig into it, talk to a consulting forester, make sure that aligns with your management goals. I think forest carbon programs are great. They're good at bringing in a new source of income to landowners that haven't been there available before, that we can use to controlling invasive plants or removing low quality trees from the forest if that improves forest condition, aligns with your goals. But again, they have to be balanced out with the other objectives that you as a landowner has.
Wonderful. Ellen, question for you. How does the DCNR go about making choices in forest management? Are you guys looking at the overall state forest? Is it site to site? How do you guys make your decisions on forest management?
Yeah, and good question. And we do have 2.2 million acres that we are working across. So we have a lot of opportunity to do some planning. But really, we planning is important. And I mean, I am a planner at heart. So I don't think I'm just biased, because it is a really important part to forest management. If you have a small lot, or if you're managing 2.5 million, acres of state forest land, is you want to make sure that you understand where those different values are. So really, most of our state forest land is not actually harvested. It's either got rare species on it, or it's providing watershed protection, or there is some old growth or potential old growth that we want to make sure that we have those areas set aside, and that we're focusing the management in those appropriate areas. So planning and inventory is a significant part of looking at the forest. And when I talked about balancing those age classes, really that is a key component. Balancing the age classes and the diversity is a key component. Like I said, most of our forests are almost the same age. And so not only just carbon wise, we're not really providing that diversity of species habitat that we could. So we do an allocation model, and we try to understand where we do need to be balancing those age classes. And then you take all those other variables, water protection and biodiversity, and kind of put those all together as far as making those harvest decisions. But the key is knowing what you have and how best to manage it, and looking at those silviculture practices that can, create that long-term resilient forest. And that's what we're doing. We're managing for 140, 150 years out, not, in the next 2 years or so.
Yeah, you guys definitely have a lot of land to measure. It's pretty complex decision making. I don't envy that at all. Matt, could you speak to wood products and maybe the substitution effect, and maybe what wood products are better than others when it comes to storing carbon, storing some more built carbon? We're talking about not the trees behind me here, but the trees that my computer is standing on.
It's a great question. So as far as we're looking at forest products go, it's important to look at what other product may have been used in place of what we're ultimately using wood for. So if we're thinking about a wooden desk, there's the benefit of the carbon that's locked up in there, like Kevin had mentioned in his presentation. But then there's also the benefit of what energy was not expended, or what processes did not have to be utilized in order to make some artificial product, whether it be a metal desk or a plastic desk or a vinyl resin, whatever the case might be. It's the question of the substitution. So we can keep carbon stored up. There's not really, to my knowledge, any sort of carbon stored up in a plastic or a metal desk, but a wooden desk is certainly providing that storage capacity. But then also the process of manufacturing that product is going to be much more efficient, with a much lesser carbon footprint, looking at that wooden product versus the other, what I would say, more artificial products that could otherwise have been used in its place. So you got two sides of the two aspects of the equation that add toward the total overall carbon impact of choosing wood over substitute products.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that the forest products industry is incredibly important in us maximizing the carbon sequester in the landscape. We can't do it without what you guys do, Matt. So thanks for being here, and thanks for talking. So does anyone want to tackle carbon management and how carbon management impacts other things? We have a question here about other ecosystem benefits besides just timber and carbon.
Yeah, I'll take the first stab at it. Personally, I think that is a big benefit of what we would call natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions. So when we talk about climate change, there's all kinds of ways to address this. We have to reduce emissions. We have to. There's no way around that. But we also need to be sequestering carbon as well. And we've talked. There's interest in engineered solutions, machines that suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's great. But that doesn't improve water quality, and that doesn't create wildlife habitat. Forests do. And so if we can manage our forests for carbon, if we can get some additional revenue by government or companies investing in forests for carbon sequestration, we're also going to have what we call co-benefits: water quality, wildlife habitat, the other landowner objectives that I typically manage for, and the traditional uses and values of forests. And so if you just walk through a forest and just stop and look and take a spin around and think about what are all the different functions that forest is doing. It's sequestering carbon. You're going to hear the birds singing. You will hopefully see some deer and squirrels and all kinds of wildlife. You'll walk past a stream that could be providing drinking water for the local community. There's so many different values that forests provide. Carbon is one of those. It's, again, one that we balance out. And that's just something I really like about natural climate solutions. Ellen also mentioned urban forestry and reforestation. Again, we know that trees provide a huge health benefit to people. So urban forestry, whether that's for health, aesthetics, or carbon, there's multiple benefits.
And I just wanted to add to that, and I agree completely. One of the previous state foresters from Texas that I often worked with always had this joke, and he would say, trees are the answer, and now what's your question? And he obviously said it much funnier than me. But really, I mean, I do feel that way. And when you talk about urban forests, or when you talk about, rural forests, or these large contiguous blocks, they have so many other benefits. So on the urban side, not only are they providing those environmental benefits of reducing the heat that you feel in those urban communities, providing shade, it's also providing a reduction in anxiety in those that live there. It's getting folks outside and they're actually walking. It's improving the water quality within those areas. There are so many different co-benefits. And I think that was one of the bullets that I talked about in those policies, that nationally, as we're talking about all these benefits of trees and forests, and really it's awesome. People are behind trees and forests now. And so how do we use that to really kind of bundle those natural climate solutions, or those the green infrastructure opportunities that we have, and really kind of combine them? As we're planting riparian forest buffers, clearly we're improving the watersheds, but we're also providing habitat, and we're providing opportunities that maybe down the line it could be some sort of agroforestry opportunities that farmers are also combining with the riparian forest. There are really, really lots of opportunities, and I really do feel like the answer is trees, and there's lots of questions or opportunities and ways that we can use them. And then you throw in wood products, and the fact that your wood table can be storing carbon is just kind of crazy to me. So really, it is important to think about those other aspects to tie into either urban work or the kind of rural, timber harvest.
Calvin, can I add something to that? Because I think that both Kevin and Ellen had phenomenal perspectives on this, and I had the opportunity last year to go on a tour of an area of forest, and the conversation was all around invasive species. And I think it speaks to how we can better, as Ellen says, answer figure out what the right question is, but the answer is trees. And when you look at areas where invasive species are an issue, I think that's where we can look to how can we intervene to try to help protect the forest health. And so in the northwestern portion of the state, and maybe in other parts of the state, but in the Allegheny National Forest area, there's some issues with the invasive species Japanese buckthorn. And so the problem is when you have a timber harvest, or if you have just maybe natural mortality, whatever the case might be, you may see that this Japanese buckthorn, it's very thick, it comes in and it kind of stifles the other regrowth that may be there. So that's where I look at programs like Kevin is talking about. And I think, boy, if we could empower landowners through having the resources to be able to control this, there's an economic expense that comes to bringing the resources to the table to control this. But if we can empower landowners to have the resources to combat these invasive species that unfortunately are plaguing us in certain areas, when we look 20, 30, 40 years down the road and see a healthy forest regenerating only because of the intervention we were able to do because of the resources that were brought to the table, that's where we're going to start seeing, we're going to start fully understanding the benefits of being able to manage for healthy forests. And I think it comes back to the beginning of Ellen's presentation, is that good management for the healthy forest is also going to be good management for carbon. And so thinking about how we bring those resources to the table is going to help us solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. I really want to expand on what you just said. We've talked today a lot about timber harvesting and cutting trees, but in the life of a forest owner, you're probably only going to do that once. And the majority of what you do as a forest owner is going to be things like managing invasive species, managing deer, and things like that. We spend a lot of time in forestry talking about timber harvesting, but that's not really what most forestry is. Most forestry is just watching trees grow. And remember, what you're doing today is not for today. It's for 60, 80, 100 years from now. So, we spend a lot of time talking about cutting trees down, but that's not really what a lot of forestry is. Now, Ellen, I'm going to circle back to you here. I'm going to hit you again for that urban forestry stuff. Can you talk a little bit more about the DCNR's urban forestry stuff? And I also, this is just a little pet thing of mine, can you talk about lawn conversion a little bit? Not everyone lives in a rural environment or owns forests, but that's incredibly important to do, is getting rid of some of those lawns, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, we have programs to get trees. And so when we talk about forests in Pennsylvania, we mean those suburban and urban forests. They all have, while sometimes folks have a hard time wrapping their head around it, those trees and those urban forests or community forests have critical roles. And so we are, the Tree Vitalize program is a grant program that works to get trees into those communities. And so those are those trees that you see in the sidewalks or in the parks. And it also sets up these programs to create tree tenders. So like I said, to make sure that when you are planting those trees, that you're actually caring for them. And that's some of the things that at a national level, or a lot of these tree planting efforts, it's mostly just towards getting a tree in the ground. And unfortunately, just getting a tree in the ground is not always the best way to manage a forest, right? And so it's important to make sure that the community or someone is tending to those trees. So that's one, is working within those communities to get trees in those areas. And then two is our riparian buffer, or that lawn conversion program. So in many parks or sometimes in farm fields, you might see grass goes the whole way up to the edge of the stream. And you can see kind of that stream quality is not very good based on it doesn't have those the infrastructure built around it and that support that is provided by trees. And then also some of those woody species, or even pollinators and wildflower species. So we are working within communities to get some trees planted and to convert those lawns, which don't provide such a benefit to those watersheds and to those creeks, and do a conversion as far as adding pollinators, which we all know is an important component. And a lot of folks are talking about that right now, and being able to provide species for those pollinators. And it also improves those conditions along the waters. So yeah, and that also is a grant program. And there is a lot of effort nationally and especially regionally in the Chesapeake Bay program to get those trees and the turfed trees set up. It's really exciting and a good way for folks to connect and understand the value of trees and what it's doing and those ecosystem services that they're providing, and they can kind of understand it at a broad, a larger scale. So we're actually connecting with folks in kind of urban or community, neighborhood or suburban communities, and able to make those connections of your small forest and what that means at the large scale and those importance of trees and wood products. So it's also a good education opportunity for us as well.
Thanks. I personally love all the urban programs you guys are doing. I promote it to everyone who asked me about it. And we just, 2 weeks ago, it wasn't last week, 2 weeks ago, I just did a workshop with Teddy and the lawn conversion team. So I'm a huge fan of everything they do. So just want to say it again, big fan. Folks, if you don't own forest, you can still do good things for the forest by doing lawn conversion, buying sustainable wood products, supporting good forestry. So just remember, you can also have an impact on what we're doing here, even if you don't own forest. Now, speaking of impacting things, Kevin, will you talk a little bit more about how carbon markets work? I want you to be a little bit brief. I know that we can, I know how difficult they are to explain. Actually, if people are interested, Extension does have we got a whole hour webinar on carbon markets. So, check that out. And we'll also be doing some more of this stuff in the winter. But Kevin, I'm gonna throw you right under the bus here. Give me a couple of minutes here. How does your carbon program?
All right. Yeah, I think I wasn't quite good enough on my previous answer. So I'm going to have to get technical on folks. I apologize in advance. There's no way to explain these without getting technical. So carbon projects, what we have to do is we're not just saying how much carbon do you have, but we are saying how much additional carbon do you have on your property or as a result of a certain management practice that you did. And that is called additionality. And any carbon project has to prove additionality. And in general, there's two things that we're looking at. We are looking at what's the baseline. So what is the carbon? We do a forest inventory for a forest carbon project, and we say, what is your starting, or what is the carbon stocks that you have? How much carbon is out there? So I measure trees, I convert that to carbon, and it's going to tell me I have 150 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, is what's going to tell me. Then I'm going to do some research and look at, if I did not enroll in a carbon project and I did what is called business as usual, what would my carbon be in that instance? And that is usually down here. So if we say business as usual is unfortunately an unsustainable harvest or a more aggressive harvest than what would be best for that forest, then that carbon stock is down here. And with the carbon project, it is up here. That difference is what is actually produced by the carbon project. That is the additional carbon. And then that can, in some instances, be turned into a carbon credit or a carbon offset. That could, in certain projects, then be sold to a company. That company then pays the landowner or the project for that additional carbon that was sequestered. The challenge really is finding out what that baseline is. What is that condition without a carbon project in place? For the Family Forest Carbon Program, we actually use forest inventory and analysis, what's called FIA data. That's publicly available data. That's permanent plots scattered across the state. And when someone lands up, when someone signs up with the Family Forest Carbon Program, let's say you have a pretty mature oak forest that was cut, or they did timber harvest about 30 years ago, was last timber harvest. We're going to look over all those FIA inventory plots to find a similar group of plots, and we're going to track that collection of plots in your project over time. And whatever that difference is, that is the additionality, that's the carbon offset. If there's no difference, 20 years down the road, there were no offsets produced. But if we can say our better management by making sure our forests are productive and sequestering carbon, and if we do any timber harvest, we're making sure we're doing those very responsibly. If we can look at that and there is a difference, then we generate an offset, which can then be sold. Calvin, is that good? Do you want me to go even more technical, or is that?
I think it's pretty good.
right.
We'll get real technical in January. Melissa and I are working on an hour-long webinar on this. So, I think that was pretty good for the time you had there. And then if folks want to get even more technical, look for that webinar. We'll go as deep as you want to go. Now, we got a less deep question here. We got a hot question though. Well, let's talk about heating with wood. What are our thoughts on it? I got thoughts, but this is not about me. This is about you guys. What do you think?
Calvin, I like the hot question there, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts too. But I think so. The question about heating with wood, I think is a helpful thing to throw into the discussion, because it leads to the question of what do we do with the low grade or so we talk about saw logs. That's the stuff that we very easily turn into long-lived products. But then you've got the other material that comes off of a given woodlot. And so the question is, how does that fit into the carbon equation as far as utilizing that? I really like the slide in Ellen's presentation that showed that loop. And certainly there is going to be an aspect of every forest, every timber harvest that is going to involve, as was discussed with sustainable forestry, it's not so much about what you take, it's about what you leave behind. But in thinking about what you leave behind, you want to leave behind the trees that are going to generate a healthy regrowth, which means that you're going to have a lot of low value material that needs to come off of that forest in order to make room for the beneficial healthy regrowth. So the question is, what is a good thing to do with that low grade or pulpwood? And so some of the things we do with it is we make paper. Some of the things we'll do with it is we'll turn it into wood pellets and heating. And so really the question becomes, is it good or bad to heat with wood? What I would suggest is that when you look at the entire equation, when you look at what it makes possible in the realm of sustainable forestry, to be able to take the low grade wood and utilize that in some beneficial way that provides us with some sort of a commodity with a value, but then also have that provide and factor into the economics of bringing saw logs to market that then enable us to convert those saw logs into long-lived products that store carbon. You look at the entire equation altogether, and despite the fact that heating with wood causes some portion of that wood, that low-grade wood, to give its carbon back to the atmosphere, the activity that enables, which enables carbon to be locked up and stored, it's still a net carbon negative equation. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that certainly we would like to maximize the amount of long-lived products that we make, but it is important to enable sustainable forestry to happen by providing beneficial uses for the low-grade products. And then when you couple that together with what might I be heating with instead of wood, would it be, and that was the other side of the slide in Ellen's presentation, that it certainly is beneficial to utilize the BTUs that are there in that wood, as opposed to going and finding some sort of other fuel source. Factoring into the carbon equation, you're still talking about, at worst, carbon neutral, but really the whole equation is going to lead you to a carbon negative outcome.
Matt, those are pretty much my thoughts there too. I actually have written a couple of short articles about it. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I think honestly one of the biggest issues, and I'm sure you agree with me on this, facing the forest products industry, and then that translates into forest management issues, is the lack of low quality wood. Penn State is doing work on it, and I know Matt, you're doing work on it. So it's definitely something we need to keep an eye on. Also, wood has, heating with wood has fewer issues than some other sources. You're not stripping, you're not doing large strip mines like happens with coal. You don't create the ultrasound issues with gas mills with gas wells, et cetera. So I'm a big wood fan. Yeah, that's my general thoughts on it. But we're going to stay on the hot topic, and let's talk climate change. How do we all think climate change is impacting and then will impact the forests of Pennsylvania in the future?
Yeah, so a lot of what we focused on today is kind of mitigation. How do we use forests to mitigate and reduce climate change? But there's a whole other component, which is adaptation. How do we think that forests are going to change because of climate change? And then how do we manage those with those considerations? It really depends on the topography that you're working in, the type of tree and the forest type. In general, there's certain species like oak and hickory that are more present to the south of us, that can withstand drier periods and more extreme weather. And we think that those are going to do okay. But there's a whole other suite of species, important ones like eastern hemlock and sugar maple, that when we do some modeling, the outlook is not that good because we're on the southern end of the range. They're a little bit more of a habitat specialist. They just can't adapt as well to drier and hotter weather. And so I think it really, you need to look at what's your forest condition. We also know that there are going to be lots of weather impacted events, and that's going to, like, our weather is going to be more extreme. We are already seeing that. We're having big rain events, which is going to mean more flooding. Our erosion and sedimentation control needs to be better. We need to think about forest roads. Also, unfortunately, that probably means more pests, more invasive plants, more forest disturbances that we are not ready for or we were not planning for. So I think for me, it means that forestry is going to become more and more reactive. And that amount of reaction that we need to do is really going to depend on the forest type.
Ellen, do you have any thoughts? How's the DCNR adapting? And you guys have an excellent climate adaptation plan. So
Yeah, and Kevin outlined those things well. And I mean, we are seeing changes in the forest, and be it from early frosts and those impacts that you see and some of those pockets. And really we are thinking about and seeing, and like Kevin said, we actually are at the northern range of some species, the southern range, that, so that Pennsylvania is actually quite diverse, and it's because we're at the top, bottom, east, west of many of these different ecological regions. And then that does mean that you might see some stresses if there's some changes in weather, either drought or rain, or cold snaps, or warm, too warm snaps. And then that affects, of course, pests and bugs. And then those can make those kind of longer term changes into the forest. But so we are looking at what are those opportunities to be thinking about those longer term potential species shifts. And we're actually working very heavily with Penn State and the professors there and understanding what are those, oh shoot, it just went out of my head, those, the seed zones, and what are those projected changes, and what are we actually seeing in larger regions as far as those changes that are happening to different species. What could that look like here in Pennsylvania? So that when we are doing plantings and we are managing for certain species, should we be shifting a little bit depending on the species and what we're seeing? And we do have some species that are declining and that aren't either going to seed or and how do we manage now for ensuring that species is maintained into the future? So that work with NIAX, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, that's part of that. And then a lot of the research that we're doing with Penn State to just really understand and try out those ways that we can be planning for not just today's forest, but future forest. Because we all plan in 100-year increments, not in 1 or 2 increments, 1 or 2 year increments. So it's really trying to understand and do some trials as far as putting certain species in orchards and seeing and monitoring how they do.
Matt, you have any comments?
I will just say, as the only non-forester on this panel, I'm not going to dare to try to adapt or extend. I think our other panelists covered it quite well.
Awesome, thank you. Well, it's getting towards 1:30 here, so we're going to wrap things up. I know that I had told you guys we were just going to do one more question about legislation, but I just noticed Ellen's little chat here about fire. Ellen, can you talk a little bit about fire in Pennsylvania and prescribed fire? We see the news all the time about fire out west. This wildfire problem in Pennsylvania. And then also let's talk a little bit about prescribed fire. I think you guys are looking at the prescribed fire regulations and making decisions on that soon. So let's hit that.
Yep, and absolutely. So we get a lot of questions about fire because you see in the news the impacts of wildfires to forests, and really we are in a different situation than out west. We do not have that high wildfire risk and those fuels that you hear about out west. Most of our wildfires here in Pennsylvania are caused by humans. So it is not from high fuels, drought, and lightning strikes. It's often from somebody not handling their fire well. But what we do have in Pennsylvania is a high forest and urban. It's called a wildland urban interface. So it's where the people are or where the forests are, and so that's something that is really critical for us in managing and working towards preventing and ensuring that our wildfire risk is low, because we've got people really close to the woods. So that's one thing. And second, we do apply prescribed fire here in Pennsylvania, but it isn't as much to reduce those wildfire loads. It's more so as a silvicultural tool or practice. So you will see many, the TNC, Game Commission, DCNR are applying prescribed fire. And I saw one of the questions was, how are you not burning the forest when you're putting prescribed fire down? And it is a low controlled burn. A wildfire would be a high heat, really tall, and would affect the forest, but the prescribed fire is actually applied using a prescription to ensure that it is the appropriate conditions and fuels to have a low controlled burn to kind of manage for those different silviculture practices. I feel like I have one more point. I don't remember what it was, but yeah, we are looking at being able to apply prescribed fire on private lands as well. We know that it's a beneficial tool. NRCS uses it as well. And so how can we use that when appropriate for either, forest management or wildlife habitat management? And it really is a good opportunity for and another tool that we can use in managing the forest. But just big difference between wildfires here and wildfires out west. Thankfully, we're a pretty wet state compared to some of the others.
Well, thank you. I know that we here at Extension are gearing up to do a lot more prescribed fire, not wildfire. Sorry, prescribed fire education. So I'm really looking forward to the results of the burn stuff. And also, folks, if you're interested in prescribed fire, keep an eye on Extension. Just gonna do another shameless self plug. All right. So I'm gonna make us sound a little bit longer. Let's talk legislation real quick. What legislation is coming in the pipeline that you folks are looking at? And if you have any, is there any legislation that you folks would like to see coming down the pipeline as far as forest carbon and just forests in general?
I'll jump in for a couple items that I'm at least aware of. I don't get into the legislation end of conservation too much, but at least what I work with and what I look for are programs that support forests. Because again, we've emphasized how important forests are for carbon as well as all the co-benefits as well. If we're talking on private land, U.S. Department of Agriculture has some great farm bill programs that help landowners. There's been questions about how do I control my invasive species. Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is nested under the USDA, that works with private landowners. So anything that would be able to increase farm bill funding to get practices or get financial and technical assistance to those landowners so that they can implement forestry practices that have carbon benefits. USDA also recently launched a climate smart agricultural and forestry partnership initiative. I don't know too much about that, but that is something that I know my counterparts are looking at and excited about, as that could be a new way to get some funding again to practitioners that are trying to implement management practices that have climate benefits, whether that's maintaining and enhancing old growth forests or controlling competing vegetation, some of the examples that we've looked at today. And then I would say finally, there's look at what is the government's role at enabling carbon markets. And again, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is looking at the Rural Forest Markets Act and some other legislation. I'm not getting into the details and all that, but I would say just looking in general at what is some of the different programs and legislation coming down the pipeline that really points at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because that's where I think a lot of these opportunities will arise from.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add to some of Kevin's comments is, I don't know if many have seen information about the infrastructure and reconciliation funding that's being talked about. A lot of those funds would be going towards state and private forestry. So we're part of the Forest Service state and private forestry, and getting some, well, a lot of it is wildfire reduction and risk. And so, the impacts that out west is seeing, but a lot of those funds also come to the states as far as forest legacy. So legacy is a easement program that allows forest management, but maintains the land as forests. There's funds that get to urban and community forestry programs, planting trees, grants at looking at landscape scale forestry. So on top of what Kevin talked about, there is a possibility that we could have some good amount of funds coming towards states to help facilitate good forest management practices, which is all those things that we talked about today, be it maintaining forests, urban forestry, or the stewardship aspect. So, getting good forest plans and management. So there are some really good opportunities. And like I said earlier, there is a lot of interest and understanding of the benefits of forests and trees. So it's good. And we just need to kind of pull those funds and those opportunities in the Farm Bill or those NRCS funds and apply them as best we can. So there's some good opportunities hopefully coming down the pipe.
And I'll just follow up to say that as everyone can tell, the main focus of this conversation really does exist at the federal level, and there has been a lot of discussion related to the various bills that have been moving through. Some of the Climate Solutions Act discussions, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill, and all of those things have different components within them. And I'll tell you at the state level, we're watching for how will that impact our ability to put the resources toward managing effectively for good forest health over the long term. And as I'm looking at some of the national counterparts that I keep in contact with, a lot of our focus is on trying to educate policymakers that may lose some of the nuances on some of these conversations, and to try to help them to understand that forest products play an important role in this, that it's not just about storing carbon in a tree. It's not just about leaving our forests alone, but rather it's about how we can partner to optimize the forest activities and behaviors. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is on an educational perspective, not focused on any one piece of legislation, but rather to help policymakers see the whole picture, so that when they're making decisions relative to these other bills that are coming forward, they can see the whole picture and make that decision in appropriate context.
Excellent. Thank you all. Matt, I thought for a second you might have addressed the toll issue, but we can leave that for another time. This probably isn't the best context for that. So we're just going to. Oh, what was it, Matt?
I said you're right about that. That would be a whole other discussion, but thanks.
Folks, really appreciate everyone for coming and staying on as long as we did. We ran almost 40 minutes over getting to everyone's questions. I know there are a lot more questions out there. Please feel free to reach out to the folks on this call. Their contact information is on the screen. I really want to thank everyone, for being on the call as long as everyone was, and answering all those really tough questions. I just want to give everyone a chance to sign off here and plug whatever you got. I'm going to personally plug Extension. We got a lot of material that addresses a lot of questions that folks had here today, and also we'll be running another climate change series and carbon market series. So you're going to see a lot of these people on this call back on that series. So Kevin, if you wouldn't mind signing.
I guess my plug will be my theme, balance. Forestry is all about balance. Old forest, young forest, sequestration, storage, wildlife. So think about that. Forests are complex, and there's a lot that we as managers really need to consider.
Helen.
Yeah, I like that. I like that balance. I will say I'll plug extension as well. We work very closely with Penn State and Penn State Extension. Really, you guys are doing a great job getting climate and carbon. This is all complex, and you throw in all, soils. So I appreciate you guys really getting the information out. And that's one of the critical pieces that we need to do. So thank you. And thank you for, kind of emceeing this discussion today. That was really helpful. And I'll plug, the Keystone Tree Fund that's new, that gets trees planted in the ground, and our urban and community tree programs. And then forest planning, please contact a forestry professional to help you think through and understand how best to manage those invasives or whatever you want to do in your forest. So thank you. Appreciate everybody's time today.
All right, Matt, before you take us home, I really want to come back, talk to your service forester if you got questions, and don't be afraid if you got a lawn to rip it out, talk to Teddy, rip that lawn out, put some plants in. Also, I want to make sure we thank the Citizens Climate Lobby for hosting this wonderful discussion. You guys got a great panel. And now Matt, finish us off.
I'm just going to finish it off with the thing that I'd like to leave everybody with is that the importance of partnerships. We all have a role to play in this conversation, and we all have something substantive to contribute. And so to make sure that we, from my perspective and my role in this discussion was to appropriately place in context the role of forest products as it relates to the carbon equation. And as we look to our partners from Penn State Extension to DCNR to the Game Commission to the folks like the Nature Conservancy, we all have a role to play, and we all can take that role and utilize it to maximize the benefits that our forests can provide for our health and for our atmosphere. And so we're excited to be part of that equation. Also, there's plenty of great careers available in our forest. And so the last thing I'll leave people with is we got a great website in Pennsylvania. It's called paforestcareers.com. Everyone's looking for folks, but if people are interested in managing our forests, silviculture, and how we solve some of these puzzles, check out paforestcareers.com and see if there's a spot for you.
None of this happens without folks on the ground doing that management. So really appreciate what you guys do, Matt. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Kathy. Kathy, thank you for hosting this. It's been excellent. We've had a lot of great questions and conversations. So just thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm so grateful to our panelists for joining us today and taking us in depth in this really interesting and timely topic. I think there's just a tremendous amount of interest right now in natural climate solutions. We urge you to follow up, and to help you with that, we are going to be sending around a follow-up email tomorrow, which will include a link to the recording, contact addresses, and some of the resources that we talked about today. On a personal note, I would say that I spoke with many forestry professionals, educators, and landowners in the process of putting this webinar together. And they are a generous and passionate group. So thank you to everyone who helped me understand forests a little bit better. I'd like to send a special thank you to some CCL members, John Clark, Lisa Richardson, Sylvia Neely, and especially Kay Kramer. Without your hard work and enthusiasm, it would have been hard to put this together. And thank you for attending.